Welcome everybody to Upper Six and the start of the personal investigation project. Very exciting project, the best one in my opinion on the course, because it's the thing that you get to choose what you take photographs of. So in the following slides there's some examples of photographers' work, there's some links and there's some audio to hopefully explain a little bit more about the ideas and the starting points and what the project's about, including going through a few sets of student work right towards the end. So hopefully you'll find this useful. So welcome to the personal investigation for photography. The purpose for this presentation is just to give you some ideas and talk through possible starting points. Some of the slides are in the handbook on the website, and there's also some additional ones as well. Not everything that's mentioned in the handbook is on here. Some things are more obvious than others when you're looking for them on the internet. As with most sort of artists and photographers, they're not identified just by one aspect of their work, so it can be a little bit misleading, which is why I'm talking through some of them as I would do during lesson. The length of the PowerPoint though is not intended for you to do this all in one go. The idea is that you can come back to it and that you can turn me off as and when you wish, as you wouldn't be able to do in a lesson. So yeah, it's for you to come back to, go off, do some research and have a think about it, and then once you sort of narrow it down to maybe 3 possible starting points, you could start to look at some of the photographers in more detail and think through your idea in a bit more detail as well. So component 1. So far in the first year, you've been working on the portfolio, which is the portfolio element to component 1. This next project, the personal investigation, is also part of component 1, but it's the main project, it's the longer project, and as the name suggests, it's the personal investigation. So you choose what it is that you're going to be working on, what the theme of the project is going to be, and then the investigation part involves you looking at lots of artists and photographers and exploring different ideas within the work and then responding to those. It's exploring your own idea. You initially need to have a starting point with some ideas of which photographers you're going to look at, both in the sketchbook and also for the personal study. And from there you need to start the project, and probably every sort of 2 to 3 weeks you need to have an idea of where that's going to go, similar to the end game but on a longer sort of time frame. We're working on this until the end of January, until your exam paper comes out, which is the 1st of February. That's component 2. Component 1 is 60% of your A level, component 2 is the remaining 40. So it is a long project. You do need to think about choosing something that you're really interested in, something that's going to hold your interest until the end of January. I wouldn't expect you to know how it's going to end up. There is a box to fill in for the final piece on the project proposal. I wouldn't expect anybody to sort of know what that is going to be yet, unless you were doing something very specific, like you wanted to work with the moving image or photography and sculpture. Then you might know that it's going to be a sort of sculptural piece or a video piece, for example. But for most people, the final piece, you won't know what that is yet, but you might have an idea of the way that you want that to go. So, the personal investigation is very similar in terms of format to the end game. It's just a longer project. So it's going to involve research. It's going to involve critical links and looking at photographers and artists' work. It's then going to involve taking lots of photos, and there are lots of different sets of photographs in this project. It then involves you developing the idea and experimenting with the images once you have them, and then it will result in a final piece at the end of the project. this forms half of your exhibition for the second year. So usually the second years have an exhibition, and the first half of it is this project, and the second part of it is component to your exam piece. This year's exhibition is in the form of a publication, a printed publication, rather than the actual exhibition itself. So it is a really important project, and it is going to be seen by others. Development, just going back to what it actually involves, development might include things like Photoshop. It might be multiple sets of images, so taking a set of photographs, identifying an aspect of it that you want to expand upon, and going back and taking pictures just based on that. So example, if you were doing street photography, you take lots of photographs, really varied sort of subject matter of people doing all sorts of things. You identify the things that kind of work in that. Is it sort of taking photographs looking through windows, or is it looking at people eating, or is it people on their phone, and then going back and then just focusing on that one aspect. So that is developing the idea, but that is just doing that purely through taking pictures. Not all development has to involve lots of Photoshop work or lots of handmade manipulation. It just depends what's appropriate to your project and the sort of things that you're interested in as well. So it might be materials, printing onto different papers, sort of stitching through things, collecting things. It might be purely based on the computer. You might be really interested in Photoshopped aspect, or it might be all about taking photographs themselves, and you might just be taking lots of sets of pictures, developing the idea and refining it in that way. It can also include work within the studio and also the darkroom. It's important this year, when you're considering your project starting points, that you're not really heavily relying on those things in order to move the project forward. They can certainly be an aspect of that, but you're possibly not going to have as much access as normal to those facilities or for as long. That's really unclear yet. So you need to make sure that you're thinking about your project so that you can be working in college and out of college as well. How is that going to work, and how are you going to manage your idea so that you're not solely reliable on the facilities. The personal study. So the personal study is the written part, the written aspect of the project. The exam board specify that it needs to be between 1,000 and 3,000 words relating to the theme of your practical work. It must relate to what you're actually taking pictures and working on. It is very, very similar to the 1,500 word essay that you've just recently completed. You're looking at a photographer's work or an aspect of photography, just as you did in the 1,500 word essay, and then you are analysing the work and writing about that, showing reference to what you've read and researched in terms of books and articles, interviews, etc. So there is a written aspect to this project, and it does have to relate. So in your project proposal, the personal study is the written part, and that's what are you going to write about, or what is the objective going to be. So for example, the objective in the recent essay was, what is the decisive moment? And you applied that to whichever photography you wrote about. Or you looked at an event that has taken place and been documented by a number of different photographers. It's the same thing, but it has to relate to the project that you've chosen. So the investigation is a practical project. It would normally, if it's in a physical paper sketchbook, be at least 2 sketchbooks. High grade projects tend to have more than that, sometimes 3, 4, 5 plus sketchbooks. It may be digital as well. You have iBooks, it might be in the form of a website. Most of your work is going to be on a website, just in general, this year anyway, to begin with, regardless of how it sort of ends up in the end. But in terms of a volume of work, that there is a lot in terms of photographs and research. I'll talk you through some student projects sort of towards the end. So traces. You may look at recording evidence of human existence. It might be your own. It might all be focused on recording the traces that you leave. You could take a sort of forensic approach to it and sort of document kind of marks and things found. You could catalogue these. It could be about collecting the photographs, objects, all to kind of log at a later date. Everything's sort of logged and processed as it would be in quite a forensic sort of approach. It might take the form of a kind of narrative or storyboard. You could catalogue the objects and things found around you from now until January. So do you do this as a kind of daily thing? Is it a weekly catalogue of events that runs all the way up until the end of the project? The effect of that is the kind of collection of the images towards the end of the project. So it's very much the impact is by the amount of images towards the end, whether that would be a kind of grid form or a book or a video, for example, and maybe there would be some of the actual objects themselves perhaps collected. You've got the option of documenting and photographing things where you found them, and then possibly things that you collect if it's found objects, to then photograph in a studio setting. So that you're looking at different approaches to image making. These could maybe then even be taken at a later date in the darkroom and photogrammed, so that you're looking at lots of different ways of recording with the camera in different settings and different approaches. It could be that your photo shoots document a journey or journeys taken throughout the project. One approach to this might be that you would map it, whether that would be sort of on a phone or an app or a physical map. These could be used in the actual development. You could plot where you take the pictures, and the map itself is a really sort of nice aesthetic that you could work with in the development of the project. You might look at the idea of trace and approach it, sort of quite topical would be to look at things to do with the virus. So do you document kind of high touch areas, things like doorknobs, light switches, door handles, etc., and things that you can't sort of obviously see, but do you catalogue this and then incorporate within your development things like the statistics of how it's sort of passed around, moved about, number of hours that it lives on certain surfaces, etc., in order to sort of make that project move on beyond sort of this week, next month. Do you follow the story in the news as well in part of the development as that kind of unfolds? So that's just a few ideas for traces, and I'll comment on some of the photographers as we move through, but not all. Sophie Cal, so a photographer well worth knowing about, lots of different interesting aspects to her work, really eccentric artist, and a number of different ways you could approach the idea of trace based on her work. You've got the hotel series first, so looking at a very sort of documentary approach. She took a job as a chambermaid in a hotel and took photographs of the objects that she found within the hotel rooms, documented these in a grid format, with some fabricated text within the rooms that she found them in. So people weren't aware that she was photographing the objects, so lots of sorts of things raised there in terms of privacy, which could be quite an interesting conversation to have if you were to look at her for the personal study. But also that very sort of documentary cataloguing of the objects in that grid format in the first image. You've then got that sort of storyboard and narrative, so this was where she was followed by a personal investigator. She knew she was going to be followed at some point, but didn't know when, so that's sort of looking at the movements of her and looking at this kind of storyboard idea. And then that idea of sort of trace, more to this next project, but looking maybe at the traces that you leave within the home, and this idea sort of looks at the bed as she leaves it each morning. a number of different ways you could use this photographer as well for this question, this starting point. Some of you will have seen the first image from the diary work that we've done quite recently, so documenting at intervals an entire day through the changing of the light there and in the grid sequence. That's a really nice sort of way of approaching and recording time there, and also some lovely sort of development ideas, the image on the right. Genevieve Cardou's work. So this is really huge, large format prints, massive on the gallery wall. And these are looking at close-up marks on the body, like scars and bruises. They look very reminiscent of sort of very beautiful abstract paintings, but are actually something quite sort of sinister. But you could be looking at sort of traces and marks, but thinking at looking at in much more detail, use of close-ups, maybe microscopes, and things like that. So this could give you some ideas for recording sort of trace and presence within the landscape. So The Line Made by Walking by Richard Long. The only evidence that this has taken place is now recorded as the photograph. Obviously the actual thing itself has long disappeared. So that could give you some ideas for how you might record the presence of human existence within the landscape itself. To Willie Doherty, images of places where events have taken place and then revisiting those. Had a student do some really interesting work based from this photographer as a starting point, and she did some research into sort of things that had taken place, events, news stories and stuff, based it in Manchester, of things that had happened. She used a central library for some of that research as well, and she then visited sort of streets, buildings where events had taken place. She outside M&S looked at the IRA bomb and rephotographed these areas now, using the story of things that had actually happened and taken place within the development of the work. So Ishiichi Miyako, some of these are very beautifully presented onto huge light boxes in the gallery, such as the dress on the left. And she recorded the city from where she lived. A lot of these were taken post-war and were objects found and traces left. A lot of them are quite politically charged as well. As a critical link, she works really well with also Tomatsu, who's on the handbook, and also with the Wilson sisters, which are on the next slide. If you were looking at sort of going to places and finding objects, or even that idea of things that are abandoned and discarded, so sort of places, doesn't have to be buildings, but it can be spaces where there's lots of things sort of strewn around. Or that idea of recording evidence of human presence without there actually being any people in your shots. Now that comes with a word of warning and just caution as well, because although very alluring to photograph, you mustn't sort of go breaking and entering into anywhere that might be unsafe. There are lots of spaces that you can take photographs, and lots of places that you can get permission in. There's an awful lot of places around Greater Manchester that are disused, and they are, you know, really interesting to photograph, but it does come with a word of caution, or a word of warning rather. with that one. But yeah, Miyako and Tamatsu and the Wilson sisters all work really well for a project there. So a variety of ways that you could look at the approach to environment. That could be in a very traditional kind of landscape sense, or it might be sort of urban focused sort of architecture and looking at aspects of the environment. So there's a number of different photographers that you could look at. You've got Ansel Adams for the traditional approach, and also really good for sort of your historical context for the essay, for the personal study. Adams more to the eye really as well, because although large format, extremely sort of sharp, fine art sort of photography, if you like, in terms of small aperture and the as true to photography as you can get, part of Group F64, etc. He's also really keen environmentalist and documented Yosemite Park for much of his life, and was committed to kind of preserving that national park and promoting the nature in a positive sense. So is a really good person to look. You'd be interested in kind of an environmental slant on things as well. Then you've got Edward Weston, who very much approaches his landscapes as he does his kind of nude images and still life, in terms of lighting and sort of framing, etc. Looking at stuff, extreme close-ups in the work of Siskin, things that might otherwise go quite unnoticed. You've got some very beautiful contacts by Lucien Hervé, who used to work very closely with Corbusier, the architect, and he's really well known for his contact sheets. They're very lovely just to view as a kind of grid. Seen those in the gallery a few times, and often he's just photographing the same building, but at various times of the day, so the sun's moving round and that's changing the shadows and the kind of shapes that you see within the image. So quite a nice idea of recording over a period of time if you looked at the contacts. You've got Burton Hill Abesha, so extremely important in terms of the history of photography, trained at the Bauhaus, so a famous art school in Germany, of which later Andreas Gursky also trained at. Gursky's large format prints, huge, are digitally manipulated as well, so that's quite an interesting idea if you should want to do some of that in your development and sort of looking at consumerism in today's society. Got James Casebear's small scale models that also give some idea about, you could photograph models, they look like these sort of huge buildings and institutions, or you could take small scale things out into the environment and document them, sort of looking at scale as an idea. I'd avoid anything with a face, like you did for a walk, so it doesn't become about a little character, but inanimate objects are fine. In terms of development, you've got people like Idris Khan and his layers, links really well with the Besha link as well. There's an obvious kind of connection with those. He sort of combines often all of his images together into one frame digitally. Lewis Boltz, so really important again, new topographics, sort of looks behind things at the outskirts, and a very minimalist approach, showing like the spatial awareness between different forms within the landscape, and they're often really abstract, looking at sort of shapes and things. So again, Boltz is well worth knowing about. You've got some examples of Robert Frank's work, so really best known for some of his photojournalist work, but this particular series here is from the Come Again series, which is sketchbooks. So he would photograph using the Polaroid camera before he went to sort of do a story, and this one was from a particular job that he did in Beirut, so he had to go and report on this conflict that was happening, and he recorded all the buildings and the area in Polaroids into his own personal sketchbook, so that he could then go away and think about what he was going to photograph and which shots he was going to do. And this was just his way of working. And then some of the sketchbooks have actually been published since, so very beautiful aesthetic and ideas for sort of development there, with lovely sort of square paper and combining images and masking tape, etc. Still, Stephen Gill, looking at the idea of the environment and the effect on the image itself, so the physical effect on the images, he's burying images. Same with Matthew Blair, photographing the lake, but then using some of the lake water to actually develop the printing as well, or leaving the image sort of in trays of the water from the lake. And he works with all sorts of kind of things in that sense, from lake water to breast milk, which is lovely. Joel Meyerowitz, who we all know best as a street photographer, and this was part of his work called Aftermath, which is a complete sort of archive of the Twin Towers and now Ground Zero, and that kind of recovery, 9/11 and that regeneration of then that area. You could use that as an idea. There's lots of construction going on in Manchester at the moment, so you could kind of document some of the buildings and changes in the urban landscape that's taking place there, and record that over the coming months. So that's one way you could approach it, using that link. You've then got the Richard Mossey, sort of the landscapes, but that use of infrared film. But quite interesting that you some development you could look at in Photoshop, along with the David Sherry stuff as well. His stuff again on analogue film, and there's some real references in his work to Adams and the great masters of photography. But really interesting sort of things you could look at for development. And then with the Yang's work, really sort of intricate digital manipulation for those cityscapes, looking at kind of consumerism and also areas of the world that aren't kind of regulated, and just this mass industrialisation that's going on. So they're really intricate, and there's a real sort of nod back to some of Paul Citron's early montages, Metropolis particularly, and Ray Lander's early photographic composites as well. So for the essay, there's a few sort of historical references there that could work really well together. So a number of different ways that you could approach human form. There's examples initially of the Andrei Kurtech, which looks at distortion. His were created using mirrors, funhouse mirrors. You've got the option of looking at things with Photoshop as well. The distortion again of Jenny Savile's collaboration with photographer Glenn Luchford for the Close Contact series, where she's sort of pressed upon the glass and he's recording her. Some really nice examples of stuff using sort of glass sheets, whether it's a shower door, but also things like scanners for sort of pressing faces and bits of the body up against the scanner. You've got a sort of different approach in terms of John Copland's looking at the male ageing form, but just some of those lovely sort of compositions he's got of sort of close-ups of sections of the body. Those are photographed extremely close up, but then they're blown up in terms of scale on the gallery wall. These images are huge, and sort of makes us realise how we're less familiar with seeing images of the male ageing form as we are perhaps the sort of younger female form in terms of the approach to kind of the human body. You're thinking about lighting, thinking about looking at sort of abstract sections of the body. It doesn't have to be full all-out nudity so that you're seeing absolutely everything. You can be quite clever in your framing and quite subtle and suggestive in the sort of compositions that you make in terms of how you use the viewfinder. Often more interesting as well. Experimentation with Photoshop, the darkroom as well, in terms of photograms, like with the Floris Noussis. Opportunity to sort of use the studio, but also have to think about how you would approach this if you were taking photographs at home. How would you make use of things within the home? Natural use of sort of light from a window. Is there use of, do you have blinds that you could use, like in the Lucien Clerge work? Looking at dramatic kind of lighting from a natural light source such as a window. You might also want to look in a little bit more detail and close-up, a bit like the Genevieve Cardew in the traces section, looking at marks on the body. Do you want to sort of look at that with a macro lens, or do you go down the road of just looking at the skin itself and the formation, maybe using microscopes and studying sort of skin cells and things? We've had people looking at like the skins off onions, for example, and looking at the cell formations under the microscope and then applying that, sort of looking at the human body. So lots of different things that you could do there, and looking at different approaches as to how you might record that. The work is likely to be exhibition, so it's going to be viewed by other people. So for that reason, the model needs to be 18 or over, or have permission from the parents if they're going to be under 18 at around that May-June 2021 kind of time. But I'd suggest that it doesn't have to be very explicit. You can be really suggestive without having to go all out sort of nude and naked, just for the sake of it. So yeah, lots of things to sort of think about there. So street photography, everybody's had a go at this by now, so you'll have a good idea about whether you like the genre or not. Henri Cartier-Bresson is the first slide, and always a good person to use, particularly in the essay. Lots of you used him in the recent 1500 word essay, so really good for that kind of historical context for the personal study, and also a good starting point for the first critical link. And then you've got lots of sort of different approaches. Really interesting approach in the Trent Park work. That's from the series called The Camera is God. He's also a Magnum photographer, and that particular series is taken at the same time every day for almost a year, and he takes that at a crossing from across the road, and he's looking at people's faces, sort of shoots on continuous fire, and then zooms in on specific faces and then records them onto 35mm film, so you get this very grainy effect, almost ghostly like effect. And he's quite interested in that idea of sort of surveillance cameras around a city that are constantly recording people's faces in that way. So that's quite a different approach and maybe quite nice for like a development idea. Lisette Modal, who you'll have seen on Everybody's Street. This particular example is quite nice of her Reflections series. So you've got that idea of maybe looking at photographing people in the reflection of shop windows. Robert Frank, the example is on a bus. You could also use Tom Woods and maybe focus on sort of public transport as your kind of theme. That might be quite interesting now as well, with the sort of introduction of having to wear a mask as well, so it might be quite an interesting time to document something like that. Parr and his sort of interest in society and British society, how we sort of spend our leisure time. Saul Leiter, always really good, I think, in terms of interesting approaches to composition. So sort of looking at using a frame within a frame, sort of shooting through windows, under shop canopies, and using that idea of the photographer is on one side of the window and the subject is on the other. You might have suggestion of kind of like the raindrops or the condensation and things like that. So he's really interesting photographer to look at. And then as you move further, you've got like the Paolo Pellegrin, sort of linking to what you've recently done for the diary project. So he's also a Magnum photographer, and the example there is from his COVID diary. But there's loads of photographers on the Magnum site that you could look at if you're interested in kind of continuing that idea of the diary, and particularly at the moment with the lockdown, some restrictions still in and still maybe spending more time at home. So you could base that as your theme, how we kind of emerge from the pandemic. That might be what you focus on, that sort of journey from now until wherever we end up by the end of January. And then as equipment and sort of access to camera equipment might be a little bit different to usual. So maybe you've got your own camera, maybe you'll be working a little bit more on a phone. Magnum photographer Michael Christopher Brown shoots all of his footage on a mobile phone. So he's well worth a look, and they're a slightly different take on that, sort of looking at people using their phones. You've got people like Baby Cakes Romero, and also, which might be quite useful for the essay if you decided to look at people on phones and devices, you've got Martin Parr's mobile phone series, which started sort of back in the late 80s with the very first kind of prehistoric type of mobile phones around. So you've got a few sort of phone-based photographers towards the end of this section to have a look at. Other people took this for the end game. I quite often suggested going out for the first few shoots and just sort of taking photographs of everything that sort of interests you, so that you can then analyse those and start to refine it as to what's the interest. So is it about phones? Is it about people sort of on transport? Is it about people on their lunch hour? And then you might then look at that sort of focus as you move through the project, and your development might be lots of different sets of photographs rather than loads of Photoshop work or loads of materials based work. So yeah, some ideas in those suggestions. Movement and time. So lots you could do with this starting. Always really popular as well. Just the very idea of the camera itself able to kind of freeze time or dissect time, if you like, and that approach to it either being a fast shutter speed and sort of freezing something that the human eye is unable to witness without the aid of the camera, or whether it's that idea of witnessing a long spell of time all within one frame. So there's two different approaches to it. You try both before you sort of decide what it is you would like to do. First one, the suggested photographers to look at here is Edward Muybridge, and it is all over motion. So looking at that picture of the horse, that really sort of nice, interesting story to it, where he was commissioned to kind of prove whether the horse's hooves were all off the ground at the same time. So inventor, perhaps photographer, a series of cameras with trip wires releasing the shutter so that it created this grid of photographs to see the motion of the horse. Always a really good person to look at for the essay as well. Love links to kind of early animation and moving image as well with that one. Harold Edgerton and the use of fast shutter speeds, so looking at high speed photography. Also links really nice with the Ori Gersh example on here as well, which is this blow up series. All of these things you're looking to take as an influence, so you're not looking at freezing flowers with liquid nitrogen, exploding them, but you might be looking at creating sort of liquids that you're freezing using the shutter. Normally primarily a studio based project with that, but there are lots of things you could do at home as well. If you have a phone with camera on it, you've likely got the slow motion option on there, and you can do some really interesting things with that, as I'm sure you've seen, things with sort of liquids or blowing bubbles and things that can be really effective. So there's other things you could look at as well as kind of like using a manual SLR, which is what you would be using when you're in college. But if the sort of access to college initially is limited, we're not sure yet, then you might need to be looking at other ways that you can record images like this at home. Lots of our sort of students that have done stuff with liquids all do these shoots at home anyway, because of the mesh you can't use the studio. So that would be a case of sort of setting up in the garden, making most of the natural light, and a plain sheet or a plain wall, so that you could sort of throw water or whatever to record the fast shutter speed, high speed photography. You've got some examples in like the Jean Milly work where you might experiment with a strobe light, which you could do in the studio. And also in response to that, it's quite nice in development, you might sort of layer up these stills. So working with continuous fire like the grids for Muybridge, you might then layer those images showing the movement into one frame. Looking at Jean Milly, it would also link really nicely with some of the Idris Khan work that we've seen a bit earlier on, layering up and looking at transparency and combining everything into one frame. Then a different approach to that, so looking at long exposure, you've got the Sugimoto, this is from the theatre series. So the camera used there is a large format camera, small aperture, tiny aperture, and a very long exposure on a tripod. For the theatre series, the exposure is as long as the duration of the film itself, so quite a nice idea there in that whole film being recorded, but just within that single frame, all of which you can't see because of the overexposure in the centre of the screen. Then moving down, we've got Sam Taylor Wood. Sam Taylor Johnson, as she might come up on your search now, but her still life, the bowl of fruit, is shown on a screen, and it's actually a video piece that very, very, very slowly sort of moves through this decaying of the fruit. So it might be that sort of idea of looking at time and recording something as it naturally kind of changes, with a view to combining that to sort of view that effect for the final piece or the final stages of that. Michael Wesley, Open Shutter. So that particular image here is of the Museum of Modern Art as they were doing some building work. Some of his exposures are as long as sort of 3 years at a time. So working with pinhole photography, and extremely long exposures there, but some really lovely images in the Open Shutter series. And looking at sort of time itself, you've got the Christian Marclay and the clock, so a video piece that's in keeps real time, a 24-hour clock, making lots of references to film as they reference clocks and whatever in time throughout the video piece. So that's well worth a look as well online. So you might be working in the studio. You certainly need a camera. You're likely to need a tripod. You're just looking at sort of the slow motion feature on a phone. And there's also things like manual apps that you could explore as a whole sort of section of development, working your way through some of the manual apps and what you might get from that, looking at filters, etc. But having to think, how will I approach it, and how will I use the time spent in college, but also how would I do that work at home as well. So lots to think about there, but a really, really exciting starting point. So the night, always a really exciting starting point, and always interesting that photographers and photography itself relying on the presence of light, that we should be so fascinated with taking photographs when there's a severe lack of it. But all about atmosphere, lots to do with long exposure and sort of control of the shutter speed, and lots of different ways that you could approach it. Brassai is up there first with his Paris by Night series, perhaps what he's best known for, and one of the sort of first photographers to take photographs at night. Really, really good for the essay, lots of information available on Brassai, and definitely somebody to keep in mind for the personal study. You've got Trent Park again, and this time this is his Minutes to Midnight series, and part of a 2-year road trip around Australia, and lots of the images not just taken at night but levelled and edited, so that they've got this very sort of dark and quite sort of sinister undertone to a lot of those, but a really lovely kind of fosse, the Minutes to Midnight. You could approach it in terms of looking at long exposure and light painting, so you might look at somebody like Tokihiro Sato and the use of sort of different lights to actually sort of draw with light. And the Twilight book, which is, there's a copy in the library, it's from an exhibition of a few years back at the Victoria and Albert Museum. That's got lots of other people that are suggested in there, really lovely series by Boris Mikhailov in that as well, and again really good for the essay to actually read the Twilight exhibition book, copy in the classrooms, copy in the library. As far as equipment goes, you are going to need access obviously to a camera. Again, if you're not working on an SLR at home, you've got the option of booking these out from college, but you might find that they're not as available depending on what the access is once we go back. So you might want to also explore kind of apps on phones and things as well. For a lot of the work you're going to need a tripod again that you can loan from college, but just to keep that in mind, that for anything that's done by night your shutter speed is going to be longer, so a tripod is going to be useful. The object can be approached in a number of different ways. You might be quite interested in using the studio and basing everything in a sort of studio setting. It might be more about being out and about within the environment, so it might be more like an object for a walk where you're actually taking an object and placing it within the environment. It might be like a found project in that you go in and finding objects, and possibly then photographing them in situ where you find them, potentially collecting them and bringing them away with you to photograph later, in which case you might have a sort of combination of photos off-site and then in the studio. Those objects, depending on what they are, might be looked at in much closer detail, so you might then start to sort of analyse those, look at them with the macros in the studio. You might then sort of look at the actual object itself in the darkroom in terms of photograms, putting them onto a scanner, things like that. So different ways of recording. You've got Richard Wentworth as a great starting point for a link, particularly for kind of like a found object, and you've got people like Keith Arnott as well in there for found objects. Some of his work of the found objects are huge on the gallery wall, very beautiful lighting, studio shots, etc. Of these very sort of tiny discarded objects. You've got Sophie Calle that you could look at. The hotel series, you've got quite a forensic approach there. You could look at somebody like Mandel and Sultan and their evidence-based projects. We've got Candy Jernigan up again, also again great for development. That collecting objects and sort of documenting them and cataloguing them almost like a kind of journal. And Joseph Cornell goes really well as a link with the Jernigan. Then something a bit different as you move through the examples in the Osang work, where you've got actual sculptures made from tiny fragments of photographs and then taking on this 3D form. Those are actually life-size in the gallery. And the Michael Snow is a similar kind of approach with the flock of birds. Hernandez would work really well with the Wentworth as a link in terms of found objects. He's also got a really interesting series called Landscapes for the Homeless, all based on objects, no people. And then a different idea again, but sort of object for a walk related, is the Big Red Ball project, which is really interesting to have a look at. Huge inflatable ball that the artist takes around the world, and inflates in different situations, recording that. So alternative processes, so different ways that you approach image making to what might be regarded as the norm. So it might be a case of working with sort of pinhole cameras, building your own cameras. You might be interested in that sort of simplicity of the basic kind of fundamental aspects of photography. So thinking back to when you looked at that camera obscura and building the camera obscura from a tube, how that actually then sort of reveals that image. If you're interested in that, then the alternative processes is definitely something to consider. It could also involve experimentation using the darkroom. It might be homemade cameras, it might be looking at the camera obscura. It doesn't mean to say that you won't use sort of Photoshop in development, because anything that you create could then be put back into Photoshop and looked at digitally as well. So it can be a combination. It's not necessarily using a traditional camera as such, but it could be. You could develop lenses and things for an SLR made out of toilet tubes and things like that, which we have had before, converting cameras into pinhole cameras. So you've got examples such as Stephen Pippin's pinhole cameras, making cameras out of all sorts of things, from washing machines, bathtubs, photo booths. Barbara S is also an example of a pinhole photographer. Then you've got people like Abe Morell, Vera Lutta and John Chiara, who are all using camera obscuras. Morell is recording them on a camera with a tripod within the camera obscura. Sometimes he's using hotel rooms for his series, sometimes he's using a travelling camera obscura like with his tent. And then you've got like Vera Lutta and John Chiara, who are both recording directly onto large sheets of photographic paper. Really time consuming, takes a lot to sort of set up, quite hit and miss as to what sort of results you'll get. John Chiara, for example, would work on one photo per day, and that's somebody who's got all of the sort of equipment to hand, and obviously the experience as well. So need to be quite committed to the cause, because you're not going to get the kind of amount of photographs that somebody going out and shooting on a digital camera is going to get in half an hour. It's going to be a much slower process, so you have to be quite committed to this as an idea. You've got examples of photograms in people like Susan Durgis, Floris Noussis, James Welling, you've got Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, you've got Moholy-Nagy rather, and you've got Man Ray, Christian Schad, etc. All really good for the personal study as well, in terms of that like historical context for the essay. So the example of Fontcuberta here is one of his photograms with liquid emulsion. He could also be used with the time option. And then the James Welling is quite nice for development, some bright colourful photograms, colour positives. So you could look at his work in terms of development, maybe in Photoshop a bit later on. Anna Atkins and the cyanotype process. So that can be done at college. It could also be done at home. It reacts to UV light, that process, so it can be done if there's a lot of sunlight, so sort of in the summer months here. It also particularly well exposed to a UV light, so we have one in college. If access to that is not as easy as normal, have had students do this where they take the actual cyanotypes to a sunbed shop and use the sunbeds for the exposure, which makes the exposure very quick, in fact. There's different options and different things that you can experiment with here, which is quite exciting. Miroslav Tichy, really looking how he makes his cameras, so very eccentric. His focus is kind of taking photographs of women without their knowledge, so not necessarily looking at following him in terms of the subject matter, but perhaps looking at how he's adapted and made cameras from all sorts of found things, is really quite interesting and gives some really interesting effects to the actual image itself. You've got the Wan Ho bacteria images, which are quite nice, so actually growing things on the actual film and then printing. Or maybe you could treat the film with different things. We've had people treating film with different sort of products, bleaches and cleaning products and things, that give some really interesting results. And the Alison Rossiter, so buying up out of date paper on eBay and then sort of developing the paper, seeing what marks have been left. A lot of them are sort of part used boxes from many years ago, and they'll reveal sort of like fingerprints and exposed sections of the paper, which is a really nice kind of use of the trace of that, so it could be used even in the trace or the time section. And some of the others are purely made by dipping the paper into chemistry, so some look like landscapes, and the paper's just been exposed and she's dipping that into the developer to create those, and some of them are really quite abstract, and that's just purely using light and developer to create these very sort of dramatic abstract images. So lots of different ways that you could approach that alternative process starting point. So lots of different ways that you could respond to the starting point of news. It could be that there's something that you feel really strongly about that you would like to focus on. It might be an environmental issue, it might be a political sort of approach to it. It might be that you're actually interested in the news itself and how that's sort of delivered and reported every day. So you might actually sort of do a daily update of the news and maybe respond to something that's in the news each day, or maybe just recording certain stories and using things like collecting images and sort of headlines from the daily news or screenshots and things like that. It might be that you decide to focus on the current kind of pandemic and sort of track that go from now and the end of January, and then kind of supplementing that with your own photographs of the experience, but it very much follows the sort of news stories and headline statistics that are in the media each day. You've got examples of Ebatinsky, so very much concerned with environmental issues, very much about mankind's impact on the planet. Very, very beautiful, dramatic sort of aerial shots, difficult to replicate unless you're maybe using something like a drone, which is obviously potentially more difficult to access, but ways in which you could respond to that is maybe finding images online that you could use in your development, and also things like making use of stuff like Google Earth and even some of the sort of archive shots of NASA and things like that in your development. So certainly ways you can use it. And Batinsky is somebody who I would certainly consider if you do anything environmentally based for your personal study. There's lots of information on him. He does lots of interviews and lectures as well. He's very vocal and very active photographer at the moment. A different approach to that might be in the form of photo montage. So you might be interested in using found imagery and creating montages. So you've got Hannah Hock and sort of John Hartfield and many others of the traditional sort of photo montage artists. And then you've got the sort of more recent work of like Kenneth Phillips. So using found imagery, that could be by hand, digitally, or a combination of both. That might be completely found. It might also incorporate some of your photographs potentially. So lots of sort of ways you could explore that. Peter Menzel's Hungry Planet. You've got some political issues running through that, as well as with the Ai Weiwei work as well. The example here is of the life jackets found, so 14,000 life jackets found on beaches from refugees, sort of trying to highlight current issues that are in the news. Mandy Barker rather's Soup series, looking at plastics in the ocean, so plastic debris, so addressing that idea of the plastics in the ocean and what we actually do with that. So you could collect sort of plastic objects, you could find plastic objects, and then you could look at different ways you could record that, whether it would be in the studio, whether it be through photograms and scanning. Maybe you actually just sort of collect and record things, so you include maybe some of the actual plastics in the exhibition at the end. Different ways you could use that, even sort of fusing with heat plastics into photographs perhaps. The Lorna Simpson Then and Now, so that was made some time ago, but it was really quite relevant with the current news story and the Black Lives Matter. So that might be something that you feel really strongly about, and there's plenty going on at the moment in the news, and certainly sort of locally as well. And kind of related to that, but a different approach to the project might be to look at the idea of the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square as your actual project. So that's a plinth where different artists are commissioned to exhibit their response to what might go on the plinth, and then it sits there for some time. So there's lots of examples you could look at that, but it might be in a direct response to the Edward Colston statue that was pulled down in Bristol just recently. So you might actually photograph different monuments and things that are in cities, and then if you're interested in Photoshop, maybe sort of redesign what you think should be on display in the cities, and the fourth plinth would be a really good sort of link to use for that. So quite a different approach again, but yes, some different ideas as to how you might approach the starting point of news. So exploring the theme of dots, lots of different ways you could approach this. Um, you've got the example in the William Henry Fox Talbot photo micrographs, where you're looking at things very close up under a microscope. So you could photograph through the microscope, which is available in college, and actually look at really tiny, minute details. And if it really is sort of about looking at things that are too small for the human eye to see, then that's a really nice starting point. Lots of use of the macro lens there as well, in going in search of all those sorts of dots and specks. A slightly different approach would be that of Broomberg and Channery, a really interesting photography duo. And the series you're looking at there, the images were actually found images that had already got little stickers on them, and the image that's actually revealed is the area that was covered by the sticker. So some quite nice use of found imagery there. The Irving Penn series Underfoot looks at the chewing gum, amongst other things, but the actual chewing gum itself is really interesting, really quite abstract once you start to really look around you on the pavement and documenting what you might find there. In terms of photograms, you've got the Kapech dots and circles, but lots that you could do with different objects of all sorts of different transparencies, transparent, translucent, opaque things used in the dark room, potentially also sort of looking at things on a scanner as well, and different ways of recording off-site as well as in college. Light painting as well could be used here in terms of dots. You could look at Sato, who we've seen earlier on, and the use of sort of a torch, creating dots within the landscape at night, looking at long exposures and circles and things with in terms of light painting. Might be more about sort of pixels and that formation of an image, how an image is actually made up. So you might kind of really zoom in on your digital images and start to look at sections, or maybe identifying certain things within an image, but looking at them in such detail that that really sort of breaks up and comes apart. So that might be quite an interesting idea, kind of title with this sort of quite abstract collection of pixels. That might quite like link nicely into the idea of duotoned images, and looking at sort of things large scale, thinking towards the exhibition where you might have huge images on the wall that close up just appear to be this kind of collection of dots, and then from a distance the image sort of sharpens and you can actually see what it is. A similar kind of effect you can get from using digital negatives, so sort of images taken, transferred onto acetates, made into little tiny digital negatives, the same size as you'd be working with film in the darkroom, so 35mm, but actually printing with those from digital printouts that then give you this very sort of nice broken up image that you could explore. And then there's also that approach from sort of language and communication, so looking at kind of Braille and how those dots actually communicate and create language is another way that you could approach the starting point of dots. So in this final section, there's just a few examples of student work. All the images are available to look at past exhibitions on the Oaktree website that you can find on the link from this presentation, but also on Moodle. And we're asking you to look for 3 exhibition spaces that interest you to identify these for your proposal that you've got to make for your project. So it's really good resource for lots of different ideas. I am going to talk through a couple of the exhibition spaces or just very specific pieces of work to kind of give you an idea of how they got from that starting point to the final piece, different things they tried and photographers that they looked at. Some of them I'll go into more detail than others, and some of them are a bit more self-explanatory and just examples of how you can approach it and how very different the outcome might be. So I'm not going to talk through all of the slides, just some of them, and some are just to kind of point out a few things. Others are in a little bit more detail. Hopefully that will help a little bit when you come to write your proposal for your personal investigation. So you have to outline your starting point. So which theme are you actually choosing, which is just a heading that you need to write down. Your initial idea, so what is it that you're going to look at? What is your idea? Is it street photography and you're going to focus on people using their devices, for example? You then need to identify 4 critical links that could relate to that. So looking at people in this slideshow, looking at people on the website that are suggested, and then other established photographers. So by that they need to be established photographers, they've got exhibitions and they've got books written about them. They're not just somebody that's a professional photographer that might be, you know, on Instagram or Pinterest, for example. Really difficult when you're searching for different themes online because it will bring up such a massive amount of information, and it's important people are established, and by that I mean they have to have exhibitions and books written about them. Other people are great for just inspiring your ideas, but they would certainly stay in the sketchbook at best. For the essay, certainly people are going to have to be able to look at books on these photographers and artists. So you're identifying 4 critical links. You've got to identify what the question is or the objective for your personal study. So that's the written piece. There's an essay that goes with this project that is very similar to the 1500 words that you've just written about the decisive moment. And depending on what theme you choose, you then have to decide which photographer you're going to look at, or what kind of aspect or technique of photography you're going to explore for the written piece. So it's all got to link together. So if it's about street photography, it might well be about the decisive moment. If it's about movement and time, it might be about the camera and how it can record what the human eye is unable to see. So you've got to be able to identify this kind of objective. It might be about alternative processes, and you might be sort of analysing, or the objective might be, what is the importance of the camera in photography, where you might be looking at images that don't use a camera at all, perhaps. So you need an objective, a kind of question for your essay. You've got to identify then what photographs you will take. So ideas for your first couple of photo shoots. What are they going to be of? Where are you going to be? How are you going to approach them? Are they off site? Are they in the studio, etc.? Development ideas. So how will you develop them? Are you particularly interested in Photoshop and exploring different things? Is it alternative processes? Is it all about being off site, taking photographs out and about? So what different ways will you develop? How will you develop that work? The final piece, I wouldn't expect many people to have an idea of the final piece at this point, but you might have in mind that actually I think I'm going to make this into some kind of video piece, or it's going to be a collection of images like a photo essay. So I might actually look at making a printed book with an amount of images that come together as a series. So you might have a rough idea. I'm not overly worried if you don't have a final piece idea on the proposal, but for some people there'll be an idea of what that might be. And then you have to identify some exhibitions that have inspired you or that you've looked at from the Oaktree website, which is the college art and design website of the past exhibitions. So you might actually create a folder and just sort of download images that interest you and identify those. Add 3 of those pictures to the bottom of your proposal so we can see which ones you've looked at for inspiration. So that's the project proposal. It's the outline, it's the plan of what you're going to do for your own personal investigation. And hopefully me talking through a couple of these examples now in this section might give you some ideas of how you can approach that. So this particular project that's on the right hand side of the exhibition board there, based on dots, actually started out as an interest that the student had kind of in graffiti and looking at kind of street art, and that idea that things get painted over or added to, and that everybody's kind of seeing them, viewing in this sort of public gallery, this kind of public space. So the interest started there. For part of the essay, did look at Brassai and some of his early graffiti photographs, and also at Eugene Auger and that idea of documenting a place. So he documented old Paris, thousands and thousands of photographs just of all the streets of Paris before a time of mass and modernisation. So they were sort of linked to in the essay. He decided to base the project in Manchester and was taking lots of pictures of kind of street art and things that he found around the city. Then sort of through some discussion, we were talking about a piece of work that Cornelia Parker did where she was interested in kind of this mass production of little like models, almost like souvenirs. And so she'd made these casts of like the Eiffel Tower, and she'd mass produced them, so they were all slightly different, just had all these imperfections, and then she kind of stuck them under this bridge, so they were all like stuck onto the wall, and over time people kind of broke them off and took them and kept them, and she was interested in that kind of interactive quality to them. So this is kind of how through the project developing, then Jacob started to look at this idea of choosing something that he could introduce to the environment to then photograph. People might add to, might get kind of defaced, might be removed, which is where this kind of red dot idea came from. Also looked at graffiti artists like Banksy and also like Tim Vader as well, and later on at the Big Red Ball project, and them taking this red ball and photographing it in different areas of different cities. So he then goes around Manchester and with these red stickers. So he has these red stickers printed, has a big roll of, goes around the city and puts these stickers in all sorts of different places. And then he keeps going back and revisiting the stickers, photographing the stickers, initially where he put them, revisiting them to see if they're still there. They've got other stuff stuck on them, people are kind of graffitied inside them, bits of them are peeling away, and records them over a period of time. The actual video piece is him putting stickers situ. So and there's so many of these different frames and stuff that this just sort of runs on a very fast loop that's been speeded up. So the actual video piece is the final piece of him placing the stickers, and in the exhibition he has this red dot with the video piece, and there's also red stickers dotted around the gallery in various points as well, so it kind of leads you to this space. But a really interesting kind of interactive project based on a red dot. So the project, which looks like a portrait project, begins as a human form investigation, and then after exploring some of the more obvious sort of sections of the human form, this student actually decides to focus on the face. She uses the studio a lot. She also sets up studio at home, and she then explores kind of the generations in her family. She has some very technically very perfect sort of images based on just the portrait and lighting, and explores lighting. And then she then in development starts to look at the use of montage. She does this by hand, she does this on the computer. She looks at printing the images in different ways, so exploring different papers, also creating digital negatives with them, going in the darkroom and printing in there. So she has a lot of different processes in the development of the project. There's also, if you look closely at the slide on the right hand side, at the image on the right of the slide rather, there's also a fine wire running on the surface of the image, and this was looking at the idea of continuous lines. So there's actually some drawing in this project where she's just looking at a continuous line drawing of the features, and in the final piece this very fine jewellery wire is actually present between the glass and on top of the image, of these montages of the sort of different generations of her family all kind of merged together. So it was a really interesting process of how this project developed from this point of human form to the kind of integration and of montage and drawing within the different generations of the family. So this project actually starts as a street photography type of project, looking at people like Henri Cartier-Bresson and just looking at that idea of the decisive moment and capturing people. Um, then this student actually becomes really interested in the actual people themselves, so then started taking the approach of actually stopping and talking to the people themselves and sort of asking them a little bit about themselves. Gillian Waring and that idea of sort of stopping and asking people to write something down was explored, but then also August Sander, she took some photographs of sort of men working, and became interested in that idea of occupation as well. So she looked at a number of different people before arriving at this idea of it looking at the actual person themselves, and then becoming more of an identity kind of project. So then through the development she started then sort of placing these dots over the faces and sort of taking away the identity of the people. Materials development wise, it sort of ended up in the darkroom, and these are all tiny darkroom prints made from digital photographs transferred onto acetate to make digital negatives, and then various objects placed over the face to conceal the face, or just printing the actual dot with the face in itself. So a really kind of interesting project that emerged, and that use of dots really important towards the end. Bruberg and Channerin, good photographers to look at for that idea of covering or revealing what was underneath the circle itself. So this project starts with the movement and time starting point. Student is interested in light painting, so painting with light, long exposures, and it's just really experimenting with that at first. First couple of photo shoots are just very much about getting the actual exposure right and getting to grips with the light painting idea. Initial links and links for the essay are photographers like John Milley and Otto Steinhardt. So looking at those very sort of early light painters. Then moving on to Tokihiro Sato, looking at dots and lines within the landscape, and the photographs become better and better, much more control over the actual camera, and much more consistent in terms of results. So going from just a handful of images that worked in the initial sets of photographs to the majority of them working. but still really sort of unhappy with where it was going. So she had lots of these photographs where they were kind of on steps of quite grand buildings, sort of like the library, town hall and things like that, and but not enough of them to sort of make the final piece at this point. And but she really likes these ideas of these very grand statuesque buildings. So she then actually started looking at kind of famous landmarks, and combining used and found images that she found online with her own light paintings. So she then looked at the ball of light for the actual light painting itself, for the actual spheres, and started making these sort of images where she had a light source on the end of like a piece of string that she was turning and rotating to create these kind of like spheres that looked like they were sitting in the environment. And instead of just these few images that were working out based in sort of Manchester, she started taking famous landmarks like the Colosseum, for example, and actually then in Photoshop taking her light painting, her spheres, and placing them within these very famous settings, and working on them just to make it look as though these spheres of light were actually hovering in situ. Then we're from Photoshop made into digital negatives onto tape, this time not small 35mm ones, but actually sort of A4 acetates that she contact printed in the darkroom, to give them this quite grainy sort of effect, and it almost gives them a more sort of authentic look, as if they actually were really in those situations. So really interesting development of a project that started as light painting and ends up as digital sort of montage printed in the darkroom. So just a quick one really on this slide. This is a final piece and it's actually a large sticker, so it is the size of the full wall, but difficult to appreciate obviously from a slide. But just to sort of point out that this was in response to using a Lewis Boltz link, which is back in the environment section of the slideshow. And this row of terrace house idea came from sort of documenting lots of buildings like this. Looked at Ed Rushka and his photographs on Sunset Strip, where he photographs one side of the street and then the other side of the street, and it's this sort of concertina book is the way that it's actually presented. So it's this huge long strip of photographs of the actual street itself, and from there she actually started to look at this idea of this rows of housing in Photoshop. So all of the sections of the buildings themselves, the windows, doors, etc., are all from different houses, and then this sort of imaginary street is constructed in Photoshop. So what you're looking at doesn't actually exist, but is actually put together in the software. So alternative processes, using the leaf skeletons and plant forms as the actual theme for the project to explore. So using that through photographs, macro lens, photograms, putting them into the enlarger and enlarging them in the darkroom, putting these images back into Photoshop, experimenting with them in Photoshop. And the final piece across the middle there are light boxes that have been printed onto large stickers and then actually made into light boxes that are backlit as well. So a really lovely example of an investigation that uses the natural form and looks at them in different ways, particularly in the darkroom, but also using some digital development as well. So just to add to this one, a street photography project started out looking at people like Cartier-Bresson, etc., and the Everybody Street kind of photographers, and the focus point became the phones and devices, and looking at people using the phone. So from there it was that idea of sort of extracting the people, lots of development in Photoshop and also some in the darkroom, and the final piece was actually all size, so that the images were in a grid format, all the same dimensions as an actual screen, and then there was a slideshow on the actual device itself, which is just on the bottom right there. And the final piece was numerous images like this where the actual person has been extracted on Photoshop. So just to add to this, another example of street photography that's focusing on the use of phones and devices. Final piece is the sticker that you see on the background, which is multiple photographs all put together in Photoshop into this huge sort of chaotic wall that's printed on a sticker. And the final piece is actually the images that move really quite fast through loads of images of people actually on devices, just highlighting how many people are actually using them. This was actually a really interesting project that started out more like an environment project, looking at the landscape. So a student visited Llandudno and took lots of different sets of photographs of the landscape all around them. Digital camera and also done on a film SLR, little Polaroids as well. So spent the day in Llandudno documenting the environment. Then was working with the photographs afterwards in the Photoshop and the darkroom, experimenting with these landscapes. But it all became about the place itself. So then she was sort of looked at like maps of the area, and then searching for Llandudno based things online. She found on eBay these postcards, really old postcards of Llandudno, and the actual project sort of became about the place itself and visiting certain places that were within these postcards. The final piece here is the postcards and the words that were actually on the back of the cards, and the actual images that the student then made them reduced back down onto slides, like traditional old slides. So it was a really interesting process, and the whole thing was about the place and sort of tracing the actual areas that these postcards have been taken from. So here two separate projects that both look at pinhole photography. So the one on the left, the pinhole cameras are all made out of matchboxes, and those are the actual cameras that were used to take the photographs that are in the exhibition after they've been used, with the little images displayed inside them. And on the right hand side you've got the actual cameras in the middle of the exhibition are paint cans converted into pinhole cameras, and the images are sort of above and below. So there's a lot more to them in terms of development, but just to give you an idea of how people converted different objects into cameras. The final piece on the right hand side, the actual images have been put onto a sticker for the presentation of for the purpose of the exhibition, and then the actual cameras are on the little shelves in the middle. So the project on the left is a good example of how the images were taken in the studio and looking at things that can then be made to look like other things. So the photographs are kind of oil and water and condensed milk and inks. You can see those in the grid in the middle, and then those photographs were then developed in Photoshop, and then using software to actually create these kind of digital imaginary landscapes, and sort of images that look like planets and the moon, etc. So it's a really interesting starting point for this kind of sort of fantasy project, and then there was a video piece on the TV for the final piece. So this investigation into the human form actually starts out looking at Sam Taylor Wood with her suspended figures on the chair, and the photographs that follow were all sort of based on a trampoline and recording the figure in various different positions as it's suspended in midair. Looking at Jacques Henry Latigue's work, who you will have seen in The Age of the Image. And from there, it was all about this kind of formation of the body as it was suspended. Later in development, they go in the dark room to do some experimentation and also then look at that idea of taking and extracting the figure and putting them into different settings. So the background images all found imagery online, and then suspending these human forms, these people, sort of in midair. They were put together in Photoshop, printed onto acetate, and then contact printed in the darkroom. The actual process that was used for the final piece, such as this example here, which was one of many, was actually printed using liquid emulsion onto handmade paper. So it gives you this really lovely sort of painterly aesthetic, and almost makes the image look that little bit more authentic and believable. So this final project uses the starting point of the environment. So the student was very much interested in the built environment. It could also have come under the theme of architecture. Initial photographs looked at lots of different buildings. It was all based in Manchester, and the first few photo shoots were of lots of different buildings. Looking at people like Helen Binet and Bernice Abbott, lots of other sort of architect-based photographers. She then looks at Lucien Hervé, and this is who the essay is based on. And there was quite an important discussion between that idea of Hervé and his relationship with Le Corbusier, the architect, and that's what the actual essay explores. This leads her to kind of focus on one building and one place. So she chooses Manchester. She also looks at the work of Eugene Auger and his kind of analysis of a place. So he's analysing Paris, lots of different buildings within the city. She chooses to analyse this one building. And like in the same way that Lucien Hervé in his contact sheets looks at all the different angles of the building at different times of day, using the shadows to kind of change the compositions and the shapes of the buildings itself. She does this with the courts in Manchester, the filing cabinet building, and does this analysis of a place many times, so lots of different photo shoots. What you're actually looking at for the final piece, so the slide on the image on the right of the slide rather, is lots and lots of strips of photographs, all made up of little tiny fragments of images. They're black and white, worked on in Photoshop, and then made into these strips on acetate and then printed in the darkroom. Looking at all the sort of angles that were within all these different photographs, she runs this sort of line through the development, which later becomes this red thread. So the final piece is these little strips of images that have been worked on in Photoshop, transferred onto acetate, printed in the darkroom, run through the sewing machine, and then finally pinned using dress pins, just sort of hovering off the board at the back there for the final piece. So it was all about the process. There was lots of different stages to it. It was super refined and also super simple in the sense that it focuses on one building towards the end, and it was that sort of focus that makes it a really coherent project, supported by the essay as well. So it was a really well executed project, and this particular one this year got the highest mark in the exhibition for the photography.